Welcome. My name is Mark DePue. I'm the Director of Oral History of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. A couple years ago, I had the honor of interviewing Senator Stevenson and learned quite a bit. The focus on the 1982 and the 1986 gubernatorial elections, there was a lot to talk about. On behalf of Nadine O'Leary, who is our current Interim Director of the Library and Museum here at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, I want to thank you all for coming out. It's a great audience. I always like to see a lot of familiar faces and new people coming to these as well. I think we're in store for quite an experience tonight, hearing one of the people who's been involved with Illinois politics for a long time. Senator Adlai Stevenson is not only one of Illinois' most distinguished senior statesmen, he happens to come from a long tradition of politicians and civil servants, and he's going to talk quite a bit about that. But I think as a start, I just wanted to very quickly emphasize the 5 generations that make up the Stevenson family that you'll be hearing tonight. Jesse Fell, 1808 to 1887. He was a businessman and a friend of Abraham Lincoln. So there's always been that strong connection in the Stevenson family and Lincoln. He, in fact, is one of the people who urged Lincoln to do debates with Stephen Douglas back in the day. So that's the first generation. Adlai Stevenson III, 1835 to 1914. For the first Grover Cleveland administration, he was Postmaster General. And for the second one, remember there was a break in between those two, he was Vice President. That was 1893 to 1897. The next one in line is Lewis Stevenson, who was Illinois Secretary of State from 1914 to 1917. And he is the father of Adlai Stevenson II, who served he lived 1900 to 1965, far too short a life for such a distinguished statesman as he. Governor of Illinois from 1949 to 1953. We all know him because he was a presidential candidate in 1952 and 1956, and lost both times, of course, to Dwight D. Eisenhower. And then, during the Kennedy administration, he was U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, 1961 to 1965, and most of us are familiar with his involvement with the Cuban Missile Crisis and that confrontation in the United Nations, one of the most interesting events in UN history, I think. That gets us to the 5th generation. That's Adlai Stevenson III, born in 1930, graduate of Harvard University, and right after that, as was the manner of the day, he went into the military, was in the Marine Corps as an officer, a tank commander from 1952 to 1954, was in South Korea right at the tail end of that experience. I think you got there about the time the armistice was signed, but had that tour of duty in South Korea. Then came back and earned a law degree from Harvard University in 1957. Here's a bit of history fascinating bit of history. In 1964, he's elected to the Illinois House of Representatives. Some of you might remember the bedsheet ballot. That was the year that everybody's name was on one ballot, and I think, Senator, yours was right at the top of the list, or certainly the top vote getter that year. 1967 to 1970, Illinois' treasurer. 1970 to 1981, he served in the United States Senate. He replaced Everett Dirksen with a short interim there that the Republican Ralph Smith was appointed to the position. They had a special election, and the senator won that year. Ran twice for governor against James Thompson, lost in 1982 by only 5,074 votes. There's a point of contention, I have to say, and that's 0.3%. That was the difference that particular year, the closest gubernatorial election in Illinois history. Then in 1986, he lost again to Thompson, but if you recall, that was the year that Lyndon LaRouche delegates snuck in on the Democratic primary ballot, one for Secretary of State, one for Lieutenant Governor, leaving the senator absolutely no choice but to declare himself as an independent Democrat that particular year, actually running on the Solidarity ticket, I believe. After all of that, he certainly didn't remove himself from the limelight. He had a very active career after the politics, very active in business, cultural relations, especially in dealing with Eastern Asia, Over the years, he's visited 80 countries. He chaired the SC&M Investment Management Corporation and co-chair for the Huamei Capital Company, which was one of the first of the Chinese-American investment banks. Chair of the Adlai Stevenson Center on Democracy, and for this audience, certainly important, a Lincoln Academy laureate. Now, I also want to mention just a couple other things. He married in 1955 to Nancy Anderson. They have 2 sons, 2 daughters, and at least when I read, 5 grandchildren, maybe more now, Senator. Author of the Black Book, which is what we are eager to hear about tonight. And I thought I'd read just one short passage to give you a feel for all of the gems that are in this book. And this is a quote for Adlai II. And I guess I can't help myself. I got to read this one. "The hardest thing about any campaign is how to win without proving that you are unworthy of winning." So now, it's my pleasure to introduce the elder statesman of Illinois politics from the most distinguished political family in Illinois. The internet says it's the Daley family, but see, the internet never gets it right. Adlai Stevenson.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark. And I just want to, I can't resist reminding you that I still have not conceded that election in 1982. We lost by 1 vote our effort to get a recount. And anyway, that's what happened. I am very grateful to Mark for his kind words and to all of his colleagues for the warm welcome back here to the Library and Museum. And to this great institution, grateful also because I'm giving the library a large collection of memorabilia, political memorabilia of my family's, which goes back to Jesse Fell. And we're here. I've also given these copies of the Black Book. So proceeds from its sale go to, not me, they go to the library and the museum and indirectly the support of this project for maintenance and eventually public display of this really unusual collection of political memorabilia. The Black Book recalls American politics, culture, and history as my family knew it over 5 generations. It's named for a binder started by great-great-grandfather Adlai I, as Mark mentioned, Vice President of the United States, among other things. He stuffed it with aphorisms, jokes, bits of wit and wisdom. And this binder became known as the Black Book, and it expanded over the generations as each added more and more material to the Black Book, cataloged it, indexed it, became a ready source of material for our speeches. It did more for my father and my grandfather than for me. Some of you may remember Mike Royko of the old Chicago Sun-Times. He remarked that my speeches made the blood run tepid. He said I had all the oratorical fire of an algebra teacher. So the Black Book helped only so much. My Black Book, recently published by, or in China, by the eminent Chinese Academy of Social Studies Press, contrasts values which made America great and values which undermine it today. It records lessons from a rich American past, and quoting both Confucius and Churchill, explains that to see the future, you must see the past. The Black Book begins with Lincoln and ends in China with an epilogue on the life cycle of nations and empires. China, a civilization as well as a state, is on the rise. Soon it will have the world's largest economy. Lincoln employed anecdote, humor, and story in his speeches. He observed, and I'm quoting, "They say I tell a great many stories. I reckon I do. But I have found in the course of a long experience that common people, take them as they run, are more easily informed through the medium of a broad illustration than in any other way. And as to what the hypercritical few may say, I don't care." Lincoln may have inspired Adlai I to do likewise. Stories, humor could make the point, engage the audience. The Black Book is rich in humor. It enlivened the discourse then, and it's scarce in our politics now. Great-great-grandfather Jesse Fell proposed the Lincoln-Douglas debates, 7 debates of 4 hours each focused on one subject, slavery in the territories. People traveled by foot, by horseback, and by wagon, and by the thousands to be a part of their politics. When the debates brought Lincoln to the nation's attention, Fell then persuaded him to run for president. And Lincoln gave Fell his autobiographical sketch, which Fell used to promote Lincoln's candidacy. This letter to Fell sketched Lincoln's humble origins. It began, and I'm quoting, "There is not much of it, for the reason, I suppose, that there is not much of me." This letter, this Sublime Letter, is recorded in the Black Book and depicts another time and man. We've gone from Abraham Lincoln to Donald Trump. Fell was the exemplary American citizen for whom service to country and community was a welcome duty. He founded what is now Illinois State University and published the Bloomington Daily Panagraph. He made money and gave it all back to his community, asking nothing. As secretary of the infant Republican Party, he was charged by its state convention with organizing Illinois' delegation to the 1860 Republican National Convention for Lincoln. Without Fell, the citizen, there might never have been Lincoln, the president. A paradox develops in the Black Book. The great presidents in modern history were nominated by party conventions, which also debated transcendent issues. Party organization had a purpose which transcended power. Party leaders, with knowledge of the issues, the candidates, and demands of public office, nominated candidates for president, senator, and governor. In earlier days, the laboring classes, many of them immigrants, piled into America's slums, where their refuge was the settlement house, the church, or perhaps the Democratic political organization. In a Chicago Irish ward, a little boy's prayer began, "Our Father, who art in heaven, O'Halloran be thy name." O'Halloran was the Democratic ward committeeman. The Democratic organization was a route to the middle class for some. Today, party organizations have little purpose except to raise money and host conventions, which are media events. Today's mainstream media trivializes the dialogue. According to some fact-checking organizations, about 70% of Donald Trump's statements are false. Remember Governor O'Malley? He was a contender for the nomination early in this process. He was ranked first for truth, so Trump wins. He gets the media attention. Money could always buy influence. In the Black Book, money is a subject of some discomfort and sensitivity. Now in our politics, it's a measure of political viability. Polls of public opinion, uninformed by discourse, and the new mass media followed. With roots in the Gilded Age and in Illinois, no Stevenson is unfamiliar with the underside of American politics. But in the Black Book, America experienced great bursts of political energy and idealism. The Gilded Age was followed by populists, progressives, and muckrakers, by Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. The 20s was followed by Depression and the New Deal. In 1948, I was a 17-year-old sergeant at arms at the Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia. I was stationed beneath the rostrum. That was security in those days. 17-year-old sergeant at arms. When an unknown mayor of Minneapolis and candidate for the Senate was recognized, Hubert Humphrey, many years later my junior Senate seatmate, challenged those politicians assembled in that hot, sweaty, smoke-filled room to do their duty, adopt a strong civil rights plank, and they did, driving much of the South out of the party. It was a hopeless year for the Democrats. They had the presidency since 1933. Back in Illinois, the party leaders gathered behind closed doors to slate a New Deal bureaucrat, an architect of the United Nations, an assistant secretary of the Navy and diplomat in the Truman and Roosevelt administrations for governor. That was my father. For the Senate, they slated an eminent professor of economics at the University of Chicago and Marine Corps veteran of the War in the Pacific, Paul H. Douglas. I was the driver, day in and out. We campaigned at factory gates, county fairs, county squares, ward meetings at night, pressing the flesh, condemning a corrupt Green administration in Springfield and the do-nothing Congress in Washington, exhorting the faithful to get everyone registered and out to vote the straight Democratic ticket. The Gov won by the largest margin in Illinois history to that time, carrying Harry Truman to a narrow victory in the country. His campaign cost $157,000. I remember no fundraisers. And without the straight Democratic ticket, Thomas Dewey would probably have been elected President of the United States. The Gov, as Adlai II was known to friends, recruited professionals to state government. They didn't pay to play, they sacrificed to serve. The Gov shut down gambling across the state. He reformed state government. The legislature went along. Of course, it helped because it helped. The Gov had 30,000 Republican employees to replace with good Democrats. That helped him in the legislature. One of these new state employees, Democrat, observed to my father that he had been a lifelong Democrat ever since he got his state job. The Gov remarked that cleanliness was next to godliness, except in the Illinois legislature where it was next to impossible. Thanked for his support for a tax increase for highways, then Representative Paul Powell, who I assume you all remember, Paul Powell of shoebox fame, he replied to the Gov, my father thanked him for his support, and he replied, I'm sure glad to have your thanks, Governor, because it cost me $50,000. Paul Powell was the nemesis of two generations. Asked for a comment after his death, I responded, his shoeboxes will be hard to fill. Adlai won as First Assistant Postmaster General in Grover Cleveland's first administration, replaced 40,000 Republicans with good Democrats, for which public service he was rewarded by his grateful party with its nomination for vice president with Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland was a reformer. In 1952, the Gov was drafted for president by the Democratic National Convention in Chicago after a brilliant welcoming address. He entered no primaries. They were formalities well into my time. He started that campaign at the convention with no staff, no program or money, and went on to electrify the world. In the Black Book, the purpose of campaigns is not alone to win power, it is to inform the people so they can make sound decisions. Trust the people with the truth, all the truth, the Gov said. What wins is more important than who wins. The fairness doctrine prevailed. The public's airwaves were used to inform, not to exploit. He, in 18 half-hour blocks of time on national television, he made eloquent, substantive speeches to cheering partisans. As the presidential candidate in 1952 and 1956, and as titular leader of the Democratic Party during the Eisenhower interregnum, he laid the foundations for the new frontier and great society and began the strategic arms control process. The opposition did more than oppose. The late Arthur Schlesinger dubbed John F. Kennedy executor of the Stevenson Revolution. Democracy is fragile, its road to autocracy and war well-traveled, conditioned by centuries of dynastic and ecclesiastical wars. The founders put up a wall between church and state. Reason would reign in man's temporal domain, God in his spiritual domain. They created a representative form of democracy, over time made more direct. Hamilton warned of war fevers in the human breast. They created a system of checks and balances. Wars would be declared by Congress. But it took little more than a fictitious attack in the Bay of Tonkin, a fictitious attack in Havana Harbor, or fictitious weapons of mass destruction in Iraq to excite the fevers and take the country to war. Rare is the Congressman Abraham Lincoln who demands evidence of the casus belli. As the Black Book explains, it's easier to make war than to make peace. I warned of terrorism when I was in the Senate, tried to prevent it and paid the price. The Gov was a peacemaker. I remember very little partisanship in the Illinois House of Representatives, which I entered in 1963. I remember no partisanship in the United States Senate I entered in 1970. The center was broad, reason still reigned, and wise men too. In the Senate, we crossed the aisle to support environmental protection legislation, consumer product safety legislation, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and many more. Republican President Nixon imposed wage and price controls. Senators tried to support their president regardless of party. But the 70s was a transitional decade. Money and electronic media, Watergate and Vietnam converged. The democratic dialogue dried up, reforms followed, and the paradox. Some reforms were sound, like campaign financial disclosure and spending limits. I was made chairman of the Senate's first ethics committee with an elaborate code of ethics to enforce. In those days, the mere pendency of an ethics committee investigation terminated your career. But some forms unraveled and some had unintended consequences. We reformers opened the doors to let in the sunshine and let in the lobbyists and money. It never stopped flowing. Legislators stopped legislating. Now they delegate responsibility to staff, which joins with the leadership to draft omnibus bills in the House, which members have no chance to read or amend before they vote on them. They spend much of their time dialing for dollars. They buy committee assignments from the leadership with money. As we reform politics, usually in the name of democracy, we made it less democratic and accountable in some respects. The founders closed the doors at the 1787 Constitutional Convention, as we had when it came to writing legislation to represent the public interest in the Senate before we pried them open. It's often easier to represent the public interest in secret. The founders closed the doors to the convention and went one step farther. They pledged all the delegates to secrecy. In the 80s, ideologues began arriving in Washington, even as ideologues were leaving Beijing. A familiar social Darwinian trickle-down economics returned, and the magic of the marketplace. Funding for civil research, education, and job training were cut. Resources shifted to the military. The budget began its descent into deficit. The Tea Party would follow. Recent history is all too familiar. President Obama inherited a budget plunging into deficit at the fastest rate in history, and 2 wars. Now the Congress is dysfunctional. The Supreme Court of the United States is threatened by deadlock. The money flows into lobbying, campaign contributions, super PACs, and consultants. By no coincidence, income inequality is the greatest since 1928 and mounting. An estimated 256 families own as much as the entire bottom half of America. The complexities of governing mount in a dynamic, interdependent nuclear world as our competencies decline. All levels of government are affected. Springfield is paralyzed. And the public is rightly concerned. Senator Sanders has tapped into the discontent, but some Americans are wrongly disposed to support those least qualified by temperament and experience, little heeding the history, the lessons of history. Our politics lost its balance, but if the Black Book is any guide, it can be restored. American politics reformed. Americans respond to challenge, but they need an agenda for renewal and reform, a response. The Adlai Stevenson Center on Democracy conducted a program on political reform recently which underscored the need to restore the regular order to Congress and reform campaign finance. Partial public financing is but one means. Other countries do a far better job of informing their publics. Indeed, some try with English language program to inform the American public. The Fairness Doctrine could be reestablished. The Federal Communications Act could be enforced. Most developed democracies generously support public media. Public broadcasting needs more funding. The public's airways should be used again for its benefit, not its exploitation. Our ballots are so long they leave the voter bewildered by unfamiliar candidates for unfamiliar offices. The U.S. is the only country in the world which elects judges except Bolivia. Do we need to elect an official to distribute license plates? Illinois has more units of local government than any other state. As state treasurer, I testified before the Illinois Constitutional Convention in favor of abolishing my office and combining it with the comptroller. The treasurer's office was an old-fashioned patronage office. I loved it. I could hire and fire at will and quadruple the earnings on the investment of state funds while cutting the budget every year. But do we need all these elected state officials and more units of local government than any other state? More fundamentally, we need to reform the system for the selection of presidential candidates. Party primaries and caucuses could be required to be held on one of three dates in June, July, and August. Campaigns could be shortened, costs reduced, candidates forced to address a national constituency. Senior public and party officials, I think, should be ex officio delegates, restoring responsibility for those qualified to exercise it. I think also that only registered Democrats and Republicans should vote in their respective primaries to choose their candidates. We could respond again, as in the past, and emerge stronger in a world that needs American leadership. Our politics is challenged, but challenge is opportunity in the Black Book. Americans respond, they never lose faith nor confidence in the future, but they need an agenda for reform, and that is why I have written the Black Book, and we have organized the Adlai Stevenson Center on Democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. You've given us a lot to think about. I'm sure it's stimulated plenty of questions in the audience as well, but since I'm sitting here, I can take the honor of having the first couple questions. And I thought I'd start by, since we've got Father's Day coming up in just a few days, if you would reflect a little bit on what it was like to be born into such a long and distinguished family and what it was like to be the son of Adlai II.
Well, I was born with an incurable hereditary case of politics. And from my earliest memory, I was set on a political career, and very fortunate to have had a father who was universally respected and something of an inspiration to me. I felt somewhat disadvantaged. I didn't want to be accused of taking advantage of my name, so I was determined to start at the bottom and had the wonderful opportunity to run for state representative and win a best legislator award, try to start at the bottom and move up. But politics, like to some extent farming and journalism, it seems to be in the bloodstream.
Do you have any particular memories from a very young age of your relationship with your father?
No, I have many memories, of course, but we were always on the move. He was in Washington, in London, in New York, a peripatetic student of the world, constantly traveling, and learning about the past from monuments and about how people lived from their slums, and as well as in the ministries. And I tried to follow, sometimes went with him. But our home in Libertyville became kind of a base where we would meet occasionally. And then business is usually, conversation was usually taken up with family matters. So I never really discussed politics with him, except I do remember him to suggest that I do what I didn't do. He said, come at a high level, and I wanted to start at the bottom level. He said, and this is good advice, get a career so to fall back on in the lean years, and the law was obvious because it trained for many disciplines, including politics. He was an example, he was not a lecturer. He used to read to us at night from Kipling and Walter Scott, but we were always sort of moving around and have a lot of time together.
One other question here for you, Senator. I'm probably not alone in the audience of people who have very recently watched this first political debate that was televised. At least that's how it's being advertised. The 1956 debate that your father had with Estes Kefauver.
Yeah.
And that was leading into, in the midst of the primary season. And one of the comments that was made, much of your discussion tonight has been about how politics has changed. And if there's a theme here, it hasn't necessarily changed for the better over the last 50-some years. One of the comments that your father made was a little bit of regret about the role that television now was going to be playing in the future and how expensive that was going to be. So my question here, after having set that up, I guess, is now we're in the age where it seems like television is definitely the main medium, but it's increasingly social media as well that is playing a role. And I wonder if you could reflect on that and whether or not that's a good trend.
Well, as I mentioned, television can be very useful, very constructive. He was able, because fairness doctrine, actually the National Committee, to get those 18 regularly scheduled half-hour blocks of time on national television for $1 million. That was a wonderful opportunity for him to lay out his program to the American people. But that's past. Now, television either gravitates to the Trump types, the colorful, sometimes irresponsible types, leaving the O'Malleys aside. And the other way to get television is money, and television is the main source of information for voters, and that, of course, is expensive, and the money comes with people who are investing it. They require something in exchange. So I'm not quite sure I remember what your question is now, but one of the points I tried to emphasize is we need to go back to the old days and make television a positive source of information for people. Make sure that candidates for high office have access to it. Now, social media is, I don't even know what it is exactly. I'm so old-fashioned. That's going to be much more difficult to regulate, or anybody can connect now with anybody in the world. And I suppose the answer is you just have to try to, excel, whether it's by social media or public television, with your ideas, your experience, your, eloquence. Social media could be a positive influence, but it's a kind of a mixed bag, it seems to me. Maybe you should answer some of these questions.
I'm afraid I'm too old for the social media trend. It's the younger generation now that is really connecting that way, and it's a mystery, but certainly the last couple presidential cycles that it seems like the Democrats figured it out, and the Republicans are now working on that as well. So, Sabrina, I don't know, are we going to pass around the mics here? Okay. And we have one way in the back here to start with. And I would ask that you wait until you have the mic so that everybody can hear and understand the question.
Hello, Senator Stevenson. We're Bloomingtonians. We're from Bloomington, Illinois. And in Bloomington, the Stevenson family has been held in very high regard. I'm in my 50s. I don't remember any time when the Stevenson family was not somebody that you wanted to know and very influential in the history of Bloomington, Illinois. And I've long wondered and never imagined that I'd have a chance to ask one of the Stevensons. When I was a young girl and didn't know anything, I was 18, Bunny was often in the Stevenson room at Stevenson Hall, but I was quite intimidated by her at that time, so it didn't occur to me to ask. But I wondered, how would you see the difference in the way that presidential politics were practiced during your great-grandfather's period of time versus how the nomination process is accomplished today? Because it seems to me when I read about it, it must have been more like Lincoln, where he sat at home and then he was told. I don't know, so I'm wondering about how your great-grandfather, what he recollected or what your family, learned about it from then.
Well, as I mentioned, primaries and caucuses were, well, for the early part of it, they didn't exist. Primaries were formalities well into, my time. I can't. Party organizations selected candidates. I think all the great presidents, certainly of the modern era, let's not go all the way back to the founders, were selected by party, organizations. My father, in that 52 campaign, he didn't enter any primaries. He was just nominated by the convention. In 56, he entered 5 primaries. One of them, incidentally, was in Minnesota. And this is why I said I think that voters in primaries should be registered Democrats or Republicans. The Republicans poured into the Democratic primary because there was no Republican contest back. This was Eisenhower was president. They poured into the Democratic primary to elect Estes Kefauver because he was the weakest Democratic candidate. So, I don't have all the answers, but you're really touching on what I'm getting at. I think we really need to, and the Stevenson Center is starting to focus on, get an agenda for reform after this election. Politics is awfully hard to predict, but I cannot conceive of Trump getting elected president. Now, if Hillary Clinton gets elected, there's going to be a moment there, which we really shouldn't let get away from us, to act on an agenda for reform. You'd think the Republicans, after what they've been through, might be ready for a different system. How you do it all, I don't know. There are a lot of lessons in the past. And I suggested a few ideas, like insisting that all primaries or caucuses be on just one of 3 dates and start late in June. We've got to shorten these elections. That would also tend to, I think, force candidates to focus on national issues. Now, if you go to Iowa, you've got to support ethanol. You've got to support local issues, and the campaigns are endless. Financing is, of course, a big problem that everybody talks about. And maybe the Supreme Court could be persuaded to re-examine the Citizens United case. It left the door open a crack in view of subsequent history. So, if I understand your question, it's the question I'm raising too, and beginning to try to answer by throwing out illustrations of that are based in part on historical experience, but without some history to guide us, as in the case of social media. I'm absolutely confident it could be done, and maybe even the parties come together on a reformed system for the nomination of presidential candidates. The problem issues don't stop at the federal level here. Look at Illinois. Why do we need so many elected officials? I think people have these long ballots. I try to be a conscientious citizen, but I often don't know who to vote for. I mean, it has to be a Democrat, but so it's a very good question for which I don't have all the answers by any means.
We have another question. Yes, sir, right here. It'll be just a second we get the mic to you.
They gave me one and it works.
Oh, one over here. You're next, and then this gentleman here in the center.
Senator Stevenson, I may be the odd duck in the room, but you've sort of expressed your views on Donald Trump. I'd be very curious to your views on Hillary Clinton as the next president.
Well, she's had an enormous amount of experience, and that cannot be said for Donald Trump. That's one of my problems with Trump. He's had no experience, relevant to experience. She is highly civilized, highly intelligent, and my concerns are, frankly, that she's just a little too hawkish to my liking. She supported the war in Iraq. She seems to be, I think, she's not necessarily good, but I think she's flexible and quite capable, and is beginning to demonstrate that, capable of, changing positions, reacting to realities. But as between, the Clintons were the first, her husband was the first Democratic president of the new era, the era of money and tactics. The first in modern history without a New Deal, a fair deal, a new America of Adlai Stevenson. She is a product of this new environment, and I think she could be a good president. It's a little hard for me to envision her being a, real reformer, but she's certainly capable of changing her mind and of learning, and she has had an enormous amount of experience. You see a little change coming. I think Bernie Sanders is having a little effect on some of her views. So I think she's got potential, but there is a history there that makes me a little concerned about her hawkishness. That's reflecting my own bias. And as you can see, or maybe in the book, it's a lot easier to wage war than to wage peace. My father was a peacemaker, and that's what we need, the world needs. It's a world that's looking to the United States for leadership. I'd like to see more cooperation between the world's largest military power and the world's largest economic power, which will soon be China. together, they could be a very constructive influence in the world. I wouldn't rule that out, having just returned from China.
Right here, sir.
Senator, let me take you back a little bit. Jesse Fell was one of the premier Republicans, and you're one of the premier Democrats. When did the family switch and why?
Jesse Fell was our first and last Republican. And I'm quite confident that if he were here today, he would not be supporting Donald Trump. He's a great man. Extraordinary. And overlooked by history because he never asked for anything. Quaker.
We have one way in the back corner here.
How did you and the first Mayor Daley get along in general? And was he more of a help or a hindrance to any of your election endeavors?
The first Mayor Daley, is that what you said? He was a help. He had served in my father's cabinet, so I'd known him for a long time. Never asked anything remotely improper. He had two offices later after he became mayor, one in City Hall and another across the street in a hotel. And if you were discussing city business, you met in his city office. But if it was political business, no. You met at the office in the hotel. He called me from time to time. And I think, this is, my father had incidentally supported him in a contested election for mayor against an incumbent, Mayor Kennelly. It was very unusual, and I think, in politics, you become indebted and you repay your debts. I think he was indebted to my father, but and maybe helping me was a way of paying a debt to my father. On the other hand, he was very pragmatic, and I think, the Republicans in that election of 1960, was it 3 for the House of Representatives, the bedsheet ballot at-large election, they were leading their slate of 118 candidates with Earl Eisenhower. Can you hear Richard J. Daley thinking? He called me and asked me to run. He wanted to balance an Eisenhower with a Stevenson. And guess what? We finally beat an Eisenhower. Although we were both elected, the court had organized this at-large election so that no party could gain a majority of more than 2/3. But I led all 236 candidates, and the whole Democratic slate got elected. And, that wasn't a bad start. I can remember, I don't know if I should tell this story, but asking a young Reformed Republican who was sharing rooms at one of the hotels down here with Earl Eisenhower. I said, well, what do you make of this guy, Earl? And he said, oh, Earl's a great guy. There's just one thing. he has gin with his scrambled eggs in the morning. Well, you know, a couple of years later, and it's a bad year for the Democrats. Paul Douglas is up. And Paul Douglas may have started this, but I get another call asking me to run for state treasurer, something I'd never thought of. And he said, you've got to take your opportunities when they come. And I took the opportunity, and I loved that office. I was the only survivor that year. So can't remember what the question was now.
Well, I'm going to follow up.
You know, this is a definition of senator. They have more answers than there are questions.
I'm going to follow up on that question because I remember reading someplace that Daley was actually supporting you to be on a presidential ticket at one time.
In 1970, I got called regularly. In 1976, I got another of these called. I had just been reelected to the United States by 2-1 against a really fine man, too, George Burdett, a really qualified public servant, but a great senator. We debated, we took issues seriously, took our 5 days before the election, we had a debate, and no press showed up. But yes, in '76, Daley asked me to run for president, and I thought about it. And then I called him back and said I really didn't feel up to it. I didn't feel ready to seek the office. He said, "Well, would you would you run as a favorite son?" Which I did, and we collected some delegates that way. I think he had multiple, motives. He might have loved to have seen me elected president, but he was also trying to gather delegates together they were my delegates, but he would control them. And that would give him influence at the convention. And then later on in the year, after the primary election, I got another call. I think the time has come. Meantime, the outcome was becoming, increasingly clear, and we decided the time had come to release my delegates to the candidate who then won the nomination.
Okay, we have time for just one or two more questions, and I see one here and the second one there. So wait for the microphone here, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Stevenson. I have actually a couple real short questions. First of all, in the introduction that Mark gave, he talked about Adlai the First, Adlai the Second, Adlai the Third, but there's also an Adlai the Fourth, who I've often heard him refer to himself as Adlai the Last. I remember when he was a TV news reporter on Channel 5 in Chicago, and I was wondering whether there's any prospects that he might be running for public office in the future. And then the second question is, why did you decide not to run for re-election to the U.S. Senate after your first full term was over? Thanks.
Well, we have an Adlai 5 now, too. He may be Adlai the Last.
I remember when my visit, Adlai the Fourth was suggesting that somebody else had a hand in naming Adlai the Fifth, that it wasn't necessarily his idea. Did I get that wrong?
Well, his mother had a hand. We both had a hand in it.
Sorry to interrupt.
I'm sorry, what was the rest of the question?
Whether Adlai the Fourth was any prospects of him running?
No, I think, this politics, I don't fault the children at all. We have, well, there may be one grandchild, a daughter, who's showing some symptoms. But this is different politics. I don't think I'd be very tempted to enter this politics either. If I were they, it's all money. It's all raising money, and there are other ways to be of service.
And his second question, Senator, was the decision in 1970 not to run for re-election. I'm sorry, 1980.
Yeah. Well, as I indicated, the 70s was a transitional era. The Senate was beginning to change. Strange people were showing up. I wasn't alone. Ed Muskie, for example, he found a very graceful way of getting out. He became Secretary of State. It was becoming a different Senate, and I'd been in public office a long time. I wanted to take a little time off to think about what to do next, and perhaps run for the office which I had always really wanted, and that was governor of Illinois, where I hoped that, like my father, I could not only serve a state that had been very good to my family for a long time, but maybe also use that as a base, the governorship as a base, for influencing the national discourse, the national dialogue. The Senate was changing, and I wanted to take some time to think about running for governor, which is what I'd always wanted to run for.
And right here for the last question.
I don't want to be the last question, but I was wondering, did you think when you were treasurer and you said something about you had the ability to get rid of 20,000 or 30,000 Republicans and replace them with 20 or 30,000 Democrats? Would you like to still see that today, or are you glad things have changed?
I've been dreading that question. I've been thinking about the answer. No. I believe in civil service, a merit system, and I would not want to change it. But I dare say there are ways of improving it, and I say that because of something that happened to me not very long ago. I had a discussion with somebody at one of the state universities who explained that it was so difficult under the personnel code to discharge that you just kept hiring until you got somebody qualified. Now, I don't know if that's true, but if so, that sort of suggests what the other side is. Maybe civil service needs to be improved, but I would definitely not repeal, civil service across the board in favor of the old patronage system. The other thing to point out is that when we Democrats could no longer compete with foot soldiers, our patronage armies in the trenches, then we had to compete with Republicans on Republican terms. That's money. So you're giving up your patronage and exchanging it for money. The issue is not as simple as it seems, but no, I wouldn't want to repeal civil service. I'd like to find some other solutions to these problems, like the money issue we've been discussing.
Senator, I think that at this time we need to get you out so you can sign some more books. I'm sure there are people who are eager to do that, and I know there will be folks who want to talk to you one-on-one about it, but it's been enlightening. It's been a pleasure to have you here this evening.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you all.